Welcome to the Problem Solved Law Lab. This is a brand new format for Terrell and I, and we're going to be diving into some of the biggest questions that we've received from our clients. My name is Jay McAllister. I'm the founder of Paragon Tech. We've been in business for about the last 13 years. We focus on enabling law firms to get the most out of their case management systems and to use best-in-breed technology to create efficiency within their firms. To date, we've worked with over 160, if I'm correct, law firms across the United States. Actually, fun fact, this week, it's February 21st, we have actually just signed our first international client. So Paragon Tech no longer is confined to the contiguous states here. So really love doing this work, love working with attorneys, problem solving, and using my default skeptic nature to command some real results in the law firms that I support.
Nice. And I'm Terrell Turner. I run the TL Turner Group, is an accounting firm that focuses on bookkeeping and CFO services for law firms. And the best way to understand what we do is we help law firms understand the finance side of their business so they can make smarter, more informed business decisions. And we do that through really helping, just make finance less scary. And when you're looking at finance, what we know is finance touches every area of the business. So we often dive into conversations across their entire business because there's a financial number attached to just about every decision you make. And so we have to understand the industry just as well as they do. Also, outside of running the firm, I am the chair of the law firm finance committee within the American Bar Association. So I see thousands and thousands of data points, and I interact with law firm leaders from small, solo, all the way up to, the AmLaw 100 type firms, and really having conversations with them about what are they seeing, what are some of the issues, what are some of the things that they're trying to navigate. And then my job is, how do I help point them to the right answers or resources that could really help them? And so looking forward to bringing that to this format of Problem Solved Law Lab.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and we will definitely draw upon that expertise as we go. Like I mentioned, this is a brand new format for us, so it is critical that we want to hear from you. We would love whatever platform you're watching this on, whether it be YouTube or LinkedIn, leave comments and feedback relating to segments that you like. And ultimately, we want to create this, and we want to make this into something that really creates the most value for you, the legal practitioner, to sort of determine what direction you want to take your firm in and how to get there. So today, we wanted to focus on a topic that is timely. This is the age-old question of selecting the right case management system for your firm. Now, obviously, case management systems, they go by different names: legal practice management systems, case management systems, time and billing systems. Essentially, what these are is they provide your firm a unified method to capture all of the relevant details relating to your matters: time entries, billing, expenses, documents, email communications. And it brings all of this into one pane of glass, so that way you have visibility over all of your matters. Most of these platforms have the ability to track leads as well as contain documents and make them easily searchable. So we wanted to, this is a daunting task. Essentially this, this is the primary way that you'll interact with your firm's documents and data. So it's critical that you get this right and select the right platform going forward. So we're going to take a stab at using both of our combined expertise, me from the technology side and Terrell from the financial control side, and we'll give you our criteria on how we go through that process. Now, this is something that we do fairly often, so we've actually developed a methodology that makes it just as simple as possible. We call it DIRE. So the way that goes is the first step is documenting your firm's core requirements. We'll explain how to do that. The next step is identifying the suitable platform for your firm. After that, we roadmap the process and figure out the sequence of events to make sure that you have a successful implementation. And last but not least, you execute. You put that plan in place, you train your staff, and you ultimately go live in the new platform. So in this first episode, we're going to cover just the first two components, the documenting and the identifying stage, just because there's so much content to go through here. But this will be a deep dive. So, the goal here is that you are very well versed in how to identify the platforms. And after you leave this video, you can bookmark this, and this will serve as a great guide to refer back to help you to identify the platform. So
I guess before we jump into that, one of the things that I think would be helpful, I think it's just really when it comes down to the case management, is just the variety across the board, like the variety of usages across the board. Because, something that I've seen to be interesting is that I've come across firms who have asked about case management. And then when before I used to just jump in and be like, oh, okay, I start recommending something. But then over time you get wiser, you learn to say, okay, all right, what is it that you're trying to do? And I realized like there's such a wide use. There's some people that they only look at case management as kind of a task management system. Some people only look at case management as a time tracking system. Some people only look at it as a document storage system. But outside of that, they're not really looking at that. So I guess before we jump into like the process, how do you usually explain to people like when they ask about like what is a case management, and what are some of the common things that you see a case management do that probably would inform the next steps that we're going to go through, like with documenting. So how do you kind of explain that part of it for people first?
Yeah, that's a really good consideration to keep in mind because, like I mentioned, we just were retained by a firm in Latin America. They have a totally different software stack than is typically available here in the U.S. So in our preliminary conversations, they let me know that they have an invoicing system that essentially connects to the tax authority there and allows them to get those invoices stamped and certified, which is part of their requirements before they can send the invoice to their clients. Very different from how things are done here in the U.S. Now, when I went to, and this platform is called Genius Legal. So when I went to their website and started to do my due diligence to, I want to get up to speed on what platforms they're using down there. It turns out Genius Legal is actually a fully blown case management system. It's not just an invoicing system, but they're only using it currently for that function. So I think it's exactly what you were just explaining, where firms, they may have various use cases for their case management system. They may be using it just to track leads from their website, or referrals, or networking engagements, things like that. So really, that's part of that's part of what we're going after here, is that we need to determine what functionality is actually required by the firm. You start there first, and then you figure out the platform second. If you flip it, which most firms do, they start out researching platforms without knowing what their core functionality requirements are. And it really sort of doubles and triples and quadruples the amount of work that you're doing, because you're working in this circular way rather than having a clear focus, documenting a strategy forward to move forward, and then attacking the daunting task of actually evaluating all of the software platforms that are out there, which, by the way, there's about 167 last time I checked, case management systems. So, we're gonna, the whole goal for today is hopefully you leave this conversation with fewer options. Just like legal research, there may be thousands of cases that could potentially relate to your fact pattern of the matter that you're dealing with, but through effective legal research, you whittle it down to maybe 30, and then maybe 10, and then now here are the court cases that you're going to use to support your argument. All right, so there was my legal analogy, trying to thread that into
But I think that's a really good analogy because, as we've worked with lawyers and talking to lawyers who are preparing for a case, I think that's one of those places a lot of times they start with is, okay, what is my objective here? And I think that becomes the start of the documentation phase because, like I said, if you just jump into the deep end of the details without any clarity on what am I actually trying to achieve here, I think you do get lost, which is why I think for the Dyer method, the starting with documentation, I think is a great place to start because it protects you from getting lost in the 160 different platforms and all the feature names. So I'm very curious, since you and your team, you guys specialize in this. So when you mention the word document, kind of what does that journey of documentation look like? Kind of how does it start?
So it actually starts before you pick up the pen and start documenting what those functionality requirements are. We always urge firms to select and assemble a joint steering committee. Now, this joint steering committee, essentially, these are the key stakeholders. These folks are in it for the long haul. They're from inception of this idea that maybe we need to incorporate a new case management system all the way through implementation. These folks are going to be there to serve in the evaluation process, to get the team on board, to help with change management initiatives. So essentially the way that we go about putting together this joint steering committee is that we want three particular criteria covered within the members in the joint steering committee. Now, usually this winds up being 2 to 3 members within the firm. We try not to have that joint steering committee be too large because then you sort of have too many cooks in the kitchen, and it's good to have diversity of thought and ideas, but you can always bring major initiatives or questions or concerns to the firm as a whole, but you want that core team, those stakeholders associated with ultimately executing on this strategy, to be confined to a few. And those criteria that you're looking for is that you need someone who is well versed in the finances of the firm. They understand the billing model, they understand the rates that you charge, they understand compensation amongst the members of the firm. You need to have that represented because, as you'll see later, this actually influences what platform you would ultimately be the most suitable for your firm. Next up, you need someone who is immensely competent in the current technology stack of the firm. They need to understand the systems that are currently set up, everything from your e-signature platforms to your document storage, to the way that your firm interfaces with your clients and they upload documents. They need to understand how this system works because you're going to be drawing upon their expertise to be able to advise on the more technical matters. And then the last component is you need someone in a leadership position who understands the overall trajectory of the firm. What are the plans for expansion and growth? What does that look like overall when the firm is in its ideal state? They need to have a clear understanding of that. So you bring all of these resources together, and this ultimately creates the perfect combination of individuals who will be able to properly accommodate for all of the firm's needs and then push the firm in the right direction as far as implementing this new case management system.
That makes sense because I do want to emphasize something you talked about with, having that cross-functional team and not bringing everybody into the firm, because something I always tell different companies and organizations is implementing a system. It does require buy-in from everyone, but it doesn't require everyone to be part of every single detail. Speaking from a financial standpoint, having all your legal staff stop doing legal work so they can join meetings about a software is probably not going to be the most financially wise decision. And I think, it's very important what you mentioned about having representation from the different areas of the business so people can speak to that. But I think it's very important for the organization as a whole to make sure that those people are empowered to actually come to conclusions on whatever is discussed. Because if those people aren't empowered to actually come to conclusions on matters, they're going to go through all of these demonstrations, they're going to go through all of these factors, but if they're not empowered to make decisions, then you'll probably end up stalling out. And I've seen many firms spend, 6 figures on a investigation process about a new tool, but the people who were in the meetings didn't have the authority to actually really make some substantial decisions, to where, a year later and $100,000 spent, they still couldn't make a decision. And I'm like, that probably wasn't the best use of their time nor the firm's money to be able to go that route. So I think it's important that that group, it be understood that this group is going to have some level of authority to come to certain conclusions to help the firm move to the next step on what tool will be selected.
Absolutely, yeah. And I mean, when I first started doing this type of work, I remember our first middle market client, they had actually gone through the process of not only investigation, but implementation and training for their staff, only to determine that at the end, this new case management system did not support leads billing, which is a core functionality requirement of the firm. So now they had essentially scrapped the entire project and went back to their old model. They undid a year of work, over $150,000 of spend on the software and training and consultants. And ultimately they were at square one. So they decided round two, they wisened up, they hired us to come in and perform this evaluation that now I'm going to tell all of you how to do for free. So,
and I think is very cool that, like, you and I talked before, like the resource I think that's going to be in the show notes for this that people will be able to download, because I think that framework is really going to help them, avoid making that very costly mistake.
Absolutely. We'll get into the methodology of how you ultimately determine what these functionality requirements are, but that's a great point. I'm glad you brought that up. We will be linking a framework document, so that way as you can make your research process as productive as possible. So as you go, rather than simply performing the research and mentally noting what these capabilities, what these functionality requirements are, it gives you a place to document those. And as you have various conversations with legal practice management companies, you can document the responses in an objective way that allows you to then make decisions based on empirical data with your joint steering committee. So one last component before we move into the, I know you folks, you're wanting to, let's get to the meat and potatoes. How do we actually implement this? But one more thing from a change management perspective, and this is hugely important. So I can't stress enough, if you could have the best, most finely tuned software available, but if your team doesn't have the buy-in, ultimately it can create an implementation that flops. One of the best ways to do that is to, I know we mentioned you want this joint steering committee. These are the primary stakeholders associated with moving this project forward, but you do want to get buy-in from the rest of the firm. So you want to create regular touch points to be able to capture and extract the considerations of the other members in your firm, so everyone feels like they had an input in ultimately the direction that the firm went in. And you typically wind up having a much better level of engagement with the firm, where people use the platforms, and you tend to have fewer laggards who resist making the change to the new platform. So last up, as far as with your joint steering committee, you want to establish a regular meeting cadence. Typically, we recommend bi-weekly in the beginning stages, and when you move into the implementation, the execution phase of the DIRE methodology, then we typically increase that to once a week meetings. Typically meet for an hour. If you have content to discuss for an hour, great. If not, you can cut the meeting short, and this provides a regular touch point for you and your firm to be able to anticipate new issues that may arise and to deal with issues that actually do arise during the process, so that you can course correct as necessary. All right, Terrell, what do you say? Let's jump into some of the functionality requirements. And by the way, at this point, if you're getting value out of this, please leave a comment and let us know that you're enjoying this type of content. And I guess conversely, we have to be fair and open ourselves up to the criticism. If you're not enjoying this, then leave a comment and tell us to never do this method again. And then we'll take it under advisement.
and I would say is, if there is something more that you would like to see, because I think, as you mentioned, Jay, I mean, this is a pretty big topic. So, I mean, there's a lot that can be covered. There's a lot more depth we can go into. Like, for example, that dynamic of, hey, how do you even select the I guess you say cross-discipline small team that's going to be on like this steering committee? Like, how do you go through that process of selecting that? Like, there's more depth we can talk about there. Like, how do you give them buy-in but still also include the influence and the perspective of other people outside of that steering committee. Like, that is a whole nother topic in change management. So I do think people that want to hear, if there's something we've mentioned that you want to hear more about, like, put that in the comments as well. And then, like I said, we can come back and have more conversations and diving into the things that add the most value to the audience.
Yes, agreed. And, we're going to be happy to answer questions if they're simple things. And if they're larger questions that require a more in-depth explanation, then, hey, maybe that becomes another episode here. So as I mentioned, this is a brand new format. So we're going to be organically, blocking and tackling as it all evolves. So let's move into Terrell. I know that, we were talking before the show, and we were sort of, we had this list of topics that we wanted to cover and provide some insight on. But why don't we start first with your considerations, which were, you mentioned that one of the first things you ask a client is, why are you looking to make a switch in the first place from a case management system? What makes you believe that the current tooling is insufficient, that you require a new case management system?
Yeah. And I think by starting with that question, you can kind of get to the heart of what is the problem that they're trying to solve for here. Because I tend to look at things from, I guess, maybe some people might call it an engineering perspective, or just from a perspective of, I'm solving a puzzle, or in my case, I'm solving an algebra problem, meaning there are some unknowns and then there are some knowns. Like, I know you're currently not completely pleased with the system or the process that you currently have. Now, the unknown is, why? What is it about it that's bothering you? Or what is it about you're trying to solve for? And I think by first starting with that, we can explore, like, is this a feature problem? Is this a education problem? Is this a accessibility problem? Or is this a cosmetic problem? Because sometimes some people I've talked to wanted to change because they just don't like the way the system looks. And they're like, hey, I want something that looks a little easier for my clients to actually interact with. And I completely get that. And what I always tell people is that no reason is like right or wrong. So we do want to just get whatever those reasons are. Let's just get those out. And then we can go to the next step of evaluating, hey, is this reason strong enough for us to make a financial investment to make a change?
Right. I've even heard, as far as reasonings for making a change to the technology stack, hey, we're losing our associates and our partners to other firms. They have better equipped firms with better software, and that's more user friendly and allows for things like hybrid work environments, or you name it. And, that can be a motivating factor. So there's no right answer. I think you're spot on with that. It's just, it has to be right for you. And it has to make sure that, you have to make sure that there is some return on investment that you're able to capture as a result of making these changes. So, and we'll talk about pricing a little bit, and then we'll talk about the methodology of how to sort of factor the ROI there. That is something that I am, I'll defer to you, Terrell, on that part, since that's your expertise. So let's get into some criteria. Yep. One of the first things that I will have firms take a look at is, or to consider when they're looking at a new case management system, is, what practice area does your firm primarily focus in? Now, this is sort of, this guide and this video series is catered towards individuals who want to perform these type of activities and migrations on their own, right? So in full disclosure, in my normal engagement, I'm actually handling this component for my client. And a lot of times we'll work with Terrell's group in order to handle the financial aspect and make sure that the books are clean and that everything jives properly from that front. But since this guide is devoted to enabling you to perform these activities on your own, we're going to have to simplify some areas to make it more bite-sized and consumable here. So one of the things that relates to your practice area is that I realize some firms may have multiple practice areas, right? They may be a boutique who serves just one, maybe we're a real estate practice, or maybe you have real estate, you have personal injury, you have some family law, you have some business law, and you have some M&A. Well, this absolutely makes the process more difficult when selecting a practice management system because they're not all created equally to serve the same practice areas. And there are variances, nuances that present themselves depending on the practice area. So, for example, I have a client down in Birmingham, Alabama, who operates a personal injury firm. They do standard motor vehicle cases, but they also perform, they take on toxic mold exposure cases, which are handled similarly to personal injury, but they're not exactly the same, right? You know, they're still contingency based, but there's a lot of nuances there and data that they need to capture. Then they also have a family law side of the firm, and that is completely different. You know, these matters are typically billed hourly. There's different documents that are required. There's different storage, that's required there. There's different court deadline calendaring there. It's all completely different. So how does a firm like this determine what case management system to ultimately go with when they have these varied practice areas? Well, ultimately, it all comes down to it does depend. And in general, I typically advise firms to figure out what practice area constitutes the majority of your firm's matters and to use that as your basis for selecting a system.
Yeah, so I think that's a really good point because, there are a lot of firms who do, a variety of types of legal work, especially if they've grown through acquisition or they brought on partners people who had a different specialty from what their original function was. Over time, you'll start to see that, your types of cases you support, will spread over a wide range. And I think that that's a really good point of really taking a step back and say, yes, we do all these types of cases. Yes, we can do personal injury, family law, we can do employment, we can do immigration. Yes, you have the capacity to do them all. But I think looking at it honestly to say, all right, when we really look at our revenue, like what brings in the money, like what is the primary practice area that brings in the money? Or we look at, our volume of work that we're doing. What is the practice area that we spend the most time on? I think when you start to look at it that way, I think it helps those firms who have multiple practice areas to start to recognize like, hey, even though we do some, immigration work, but if it's only 5% of my volume of my law firm, I am not going to pick a practice management or case management software that is catered towards immigration if it's only 5% of my entire business. I think that is a very, very good point and way to look at it.
Mm-hmm. Agreed. And, because there is some level of variance here, I will say that there are actually, and this is a secret, but there are some clients that we've actually recommended implement 2 separate case management platforms. It's very rare. But, and typically these firms, the deciding factor becomes if there's an equal representation of matters in that firm, sort of a near 50-50 split, and the team members that operate in one practice area are separate from team members that operate in the other, then in those scenarios, there is operating in 2 case management systems becomes a possibility since there is an overlap and you don't have to dual train your staff on both systems. So by and large, the ideal scenario is to operate in one and sort of create a unified pane of glass to view your firm through. So next up this is a quick one, but just the firm size overall. When you look at your firm's staff count, both attorneys, senior, junior, as well as paralegals, admins, and support staff, you want to make sure that you document that. This will become important when you're looking to select a case management system because there are differences in how you run a 50-person firm versus a solo practitioner firm. The processes, the workflows, the documents, the naming convention, all of these will differ. So you want to make sure that, if you're following through and using the document that we provided in the resources, make sure to document the total staff size and make sure to break it out between the respective professionals, mainly attorneys, paralegals, and support staff, and other staff.
Now, I guess to help people understand, the significance of that, Have you seen any types of case management softwares where the size of their firm, like the number of staff that they have, will have a really, big impact on, how the software performs or what capabilities are available to them?
Yes, actually, that's a great question you asked. There are, and we'll get into, I promise in step two, we'll actually give you some concrete examples, and we'll pair some of these functionality requirements and give you some context about how they relate to various case management systems. In general, there is a fairly large divide between the feature set of these platforms that are more catering towards solos and small firms versus sort of middle market firms. And that's all we'll touch on today. For AmLaw, that'll be a different video from someone, two other gentlemen who, like our doppelgangers in Big Law. But so there is a fairly significant difference between how these platforms work and even the number of users that they can support. In some platforms, you'll actually see the interface starts to slow down because you're on a shared server. And as you start to gain a larger user count, it can actually overwhelm the infrastructure. And then now you're dealing with a system that's loading slowly, where documents are not populating properly. We've seen it before. So, and we'll give you some feedback on which platforms are more suited for small and solos versus middle market firms.
Yeah. And the last thing I would say on that too is, for both of the things we just talked about, practice area and size of the firm, there are some, case management softwares, when you go and you look at their website or you look at information about them, they'll tell you that their software is not good for this type of firm. I've seen some where it comes out and it tells you like, hey, our software is not good for mass torts. So if you're doing mass tort is an area that you're focused on as a firm, you kind of know like this software is not designed to accommodate the practice area where I spend my time. And also I've seen where different case management softwares will come out and say, hey, we're designed for solo up to 200 people in a firm. You go past 200, like it's just a red flag. Like their software is not gonna be a good fit for you if what you have is more than what they're capable to support.
Right. And they have a really good idea. These case management systems, they have a really good idea of the areas that their platform excels in and then areas where it's a little bit weaker in. Pretty much all of them that I've talked to, they have very detailed battle cards, which actually stack the features directly head to head between other competing platforms in the market. So, and they actually tend to use a universal naming convention behind features where they essentially shop each other and they kind of keep tabs on each other. So we're ultimately trying to bring that to you. So you have the ability to make these decisions based on, we want to level the playing field and give you universal data. So next one is one that I know you'll have a lot to talk about. So I likely will defer mostly to you on this one, but this is something that comes up fairly often. There are various case management systems that have they rely either A, on an external integration with your accounting package, such as a QuickBooks or Xero, you name it. And then there are case management systems that have actually been designed from the ground up to contain their own accounting system. They call it a general ledger. So, and then there are actually platforms who weren't designed with that originally, and then they've added that on at a later date, their accounting package. So this is something that, when a firm's looking to migrate to a new case management system, they need to ultimately determine the comfort level or the agreeability of their bookkeeper, accounting staff to use potentially another platform that's not what they're used to, like a QuickBooks or a Xero. Because that may actually invalidate certain platforms. If, let's say, you're working with a bookkeeper who you just love, they know your firm, they understand how to categorize your expenses, it's really easy to work with them, and then you tell them, hey, I know we've been operating within QuickBooks, but in order to reap efficiencies in other areas of our firm, we're going to onboard into a new case management system which doesn't use QuickBooks, and you're going to have to learn that software. That may be a deal breaker for them. So, Terrell, what do you typically see and advise your clients when they're making these when they're in these transitionary moments? How do you advise them as far as the accounting and bookkeeping side of things.
Now, I will warn, this may not be a very popular opinion with a lot of people. But I tend to look at this as, you know what, never put yourself in a position where your ability to make the best decision for the firm is held prisoner to, you know, a third party vendor or internal employees. Like, never feel like you're stuck because, hey, well, the person who does our accounting only knows this system, or, you know, the staff will be upset if we make this change. I think you have to look objectively to say, what is the best decision for our organization? Now, when I'm walking a company through that, I'm like, okay, all right, you want to change case management software. What are we going to do about your finance situation? What I would say is, or your financial system, I would say is, we want to go through a couple of questions. The first one is, okay, what are you really needing from your financial system? Like, what do you get now that you pay attention to? Because, you know, believe it or not every firm actually looks at their financial numbers. So the first thing we need to do is, like, how sophisticated do you need this system to be? Because if you're just looking at a basic financial statement, like how much money do we have come in, what were our expenses, what was the bottom line, you probably don't need a super sophisticated system. And I think you have to be honest with yourself about that. And then also is, you know, what's the timing that you need this? Because a lot of times, I think that, you know, different firms are looking to say, okay, what accounting system should we use? Well, this one could give us real-time data. And the question I always ask is, okay, do you actually need real-time data on your accounting and your finances? And for the most part, I would say is most firms, you don't need real-time data. Now, you may need some, you know, current, you know, day of data to understand how much money do we have in a bank if you need to make a certain decision. But for the most part, most people aren't going to look at their financials on a daily basis. So I think if you get honest with yourself first, what do I need from my accounting system? And then I think also is asking yourself is, am I going to manage the accounting function in-house, or will I manage it with a third party? I always recommend, if you are going the route of having a third party, an outside company, manage your accounting records, you don't want to go with a accounting solution that very, very, very few people know. Because what that's going to do is it's going to limit your ability to pick the right vendor to support your firm. I mean, I've come across many law firms who are using a bookkeeper, using an accountant that they know is underperforming, but that's the only person that knows the system that they're using. So they feel like they're just stuck working with that person. And so I would say is, if your needs are not, you know, overly unique, you can probably, you know, do very well using a third party system that isn't built into the case management software. And some may say, well, what if this case management software doesn't integrate with the third party? And to be completely honest, and this is where my unpopular opinion comes in, is I think integration with your accounting system is highly overrated. And I say this as an accountant who our firm primarily focuses on that, because a lot of times when I talk to different firms about, okay, what value do you get by this system being integrated with your accounting system? Most people have no clue, like what's the actual value that you get. And so if there really isn't a true driving value for you, then I would ask, it's like, well, do you actually need it to integrate? Because the biggest value for your accounting system is really being able to take what is happening in your bank account, meaning all the money coming in, all the money going out, and being able to sort that out to put that in a view so you understand, here's what our income was, here's what our expenses were, here's what is left over. And most of the, I would say, practice or case management softwares, they do a good job of handling maybe your billing, They do a good job of handling maybe trust accounting if that's involved, but they don't always do a great job of handling all the other business expenses that you have. And so I always say is if you are going to look at the accounting system that is built into the tool, we need to make sure, will that accounting system be able to produce the level of financial statements and financial information you need to understand your whole business? Or is that tool really just designed to give you a view of what you build or what you invoice, what you collected, which is only a small part of your overall financial picture?
Now, this is interesting because I think this is what people are ultimately watching this video to determine. They want to bring the technology perspective and also the financial perspective. So I'd actually like to chase down that idea a little bit more because you mentioned that we've talked about this before, but I'd like to go into detail on, you say that there's not necessarily a large benefit in integrating your accounting package with your case management system. Now, this is interesting because from this perspective, this is one of the criteria that I make my clients consider. I don't make them do anything; they can do whatever they want, right? But this is one of the criteria that I have them consider when they're looking to pick a new case management system. Maybe the process could be easier. Maybe this doesn't necessarily need to be considered. So I'm curious, from my perspective on the technology front, my goal has always been to make sure to create interoperability behind their entire software stack. But maybe that's not required. So what I'd like to know from you is, you're saying, from what I'm hearing, you're saying it may not be beneficial to integrate your system. So to me, I'm assuming that there's some deficit or there's some detriment that's created by connecting the system that creates unnecessary complexity, or I don't know, what is that of why you're saying it may not be beneficial to integrate those?
So the main reason why I say it, and again, I approach this from a solving a problem solving perspective, which is why I start off with the question, like when someone tells me that, hey, this new case management is going to integrate with our accounting system. The first question I ask is, okay, why does that matter to you? And if they don't have a answer for why is that important? Like, I'm sure it sounds good to say that, hey, this system integrates with this one, but why does that matter to you? Because at the end of the day, my goal isn't just to, help you get a fully integrated system. It's to help you get an overall solution that's going to help you achieve the goal that you have. Now, if we don't have a business objective as to why that's important or why that's valuable, then the question I would ask is, okay, so if we don't even know why this is valuable to your firm, like, why does this matter? Now, what I would tell what firms have told me is, well, this system integrating with this system is great because trust accounting is usually the biggest thing. Is I can see what my trust accounting will always align. And I would say is, in one aspect, you are right. Yes, when you look at the invoicing that happens in your case management software, that data is going to feed over into your accounting system. So you'll be able to see that the invoicing, it aligns. The question then becomes, well, what about the banking information? Because usually the banking information, the infrastructure of that data isn't on the same infrastructure as your case management software. So yes, you may be able to see the same invoices in your practice management that you do in your accounting software, but who's going to manage the connection between when the money actually shows up in the bank? Who's going to manage that process of connecting those bank transactions to what your case management fed over? And at the moment, that process isn't automated just because the way the bank feeds data in and the way the practice management feeds data in isn't the same. And to give you a very clear practical example, let's say we have, 5 clients. You sent out invoices to those clients and those clients paid their invoices. So on your case management software, it's going to send data over to your accounting system to say, hey, these 5 clients, we invoiced them and they made a payment. So it's going to look like 5 separate transactions. But when the bank account puts the money into your account, it's probably going to come as one lump sum, deposit. So how will the banking system know I need to split this one transaction into these 5 clients? Well, that's where you're probably going to need someone in accounting on the back end that's kind of, decoding those transactions and marrying those two things together. And I think that a lot of times when you hear different case management softwares talk about, well, we integrate with your accounting system, it's just like, that's only maybe 50% of, or maybe even 25% of the accounting process. We still need to connect this to what actually happened in the bank. And at the end of the day, when I talk to different law firms, the main thing that they really care about is, did the money show up in my account? Because, the case management system could say they paid, but if the money didn't actually show up in your actual bank account, then you don't really have a full picture. And that's why I say that often I feel like the integration of case management data into your accounting system, I think, is often overrated, because that is not the full picture of what happens in your accounting process. That's only maybe 25 to 50% of the whole process.
Yeah, that's great. So you're creating potentially, I'm seeing it as a scenario where you're potentially creating additional work if things aren't matched properly. And even if things are matched properly, there's still a manual step that needs to occur. So the integration doesn't really net a huge productivity increase in many of those cases, which is why you're saying that you need a clear reason for why the integration will be useful for your firm in order to have that be considered as table stakes for what your firm needs in order to check all the boxes for its functionality requirements.
Absolutely. And I think that's where a lot of firms run into issues with their accountant that they're using is, even if they have someone in-house, one of the questions that a lot of firm leadership ask is, well, why does the accounting process take so long? Like, they told me my case management system and it integrates into the accounting system, so why does it take so long? And then you have to explain is just, well, the only thing that's really integrating is the actual invoice data, and that is not interacting with the actual banking data. So I'm like, there's a whole nother level of effort that's required to bring these two things together. And I think that most case management or practice management softwares don't fully understand that. And I think, I don't expect them to, because most case management softwares were not designed to be accounting softwares. They were designed to be case management, not accounting systems. Now, some of them do go on to add accounting software and features to it, but I will say, from what I have seen across a lot of the different case management softwares, is there's still a lot of work for those case management softwares to really get to a point where their accounting system that they've added is robust enough to really be a seamless integration.
Sure, that makes sense. Now, let's switch gears a little bit and talk about lead generation strategies, because this is something that also would dictate what platform would be most suitable for your firm. Is you need to understand from a perspective of, how does your firm ultimately generate its leads that ultimately turn into retained clients, hopefully? Do you have lawyers that engage in individual networking? Or do you have Google Ads set up? Or do you perform radio commercials? There are various methods, and you need to just make sure you understand and document those, so that way you can take those into consideration properly as far as the case management system that you'll ultimately go with. This sort of, Terrell, I'll give you a second too if you want to comment on that.
Yeah, I totally agree with that. I mean, I think if you're going to be a firm that is heavy on, you're doing marketing, you're doing advertising, you get a lot of leads in, or I would say is strangers who find your firm and then want to inquire about your services. Like, if that is a heavy part of your business, then you need a way to track that and stay organized. because if you don't have a way to track that and stay organized, then you're not going to be able to help those people go through the process of going from being a stranger to eventually being a paying client. And so I do think that if your business model works that way, it's very, very important. Now, on the other hand, as you were mentioning, Jay, is if your business model is, hey, we have some really good rainmakers in the company. Most of our business comes from them doing networking and them doing, person-to-person conversations or a hand-to-hand interaction. Then I would say the lead management feature may not rank as high of a priority when you're looking at your softwares.
Yeah, I thought you were going to say that it wouldn't be necessary. So that was going to be my first point I disagreed on, but I think we're on the same page there, is that it won't rank as highly. I have a client who is an insurance defense firm. I use them as an example for so many things. But they're an insurance defense firm, and the primary driver for new business is they create relationships with insurance carriers. They go to insurance carrier events, conferences where these folks will be at, and they don't really have any other business generation that happens outside of that. So their whole focus is just, hey, I just need to make sure I'm up to speed and I engage regularly with these folks so that I can generate relationships that will ultimately create new business opportunities for us. So for them, having a robust lead management system was not very high on the list of priorities. So you just have to know for your own firm and make sure you document exactly what that is and how you ultimately source your leads, so that way you can take that into consideration.
Yeah, and one thing I'll say on that, I think even in that case you just mentioned is, if I were talking to that firm, what I would tell them is you need something that just kind of allows you to track notes on the relationships that you need something to help you manage the relationships that you're developing. So, and that's why I said is that, hey, a full lead management may not be as high of a priority, but some way to be able to track how you're developing those relationships that do lead to clients so that other people in the firm can see it. Because I think if you consider it from a longevity standpoint in your firm, is, let's say you bring on new partners or you bring on more attorneys, you don't want to lose that, that tribal knowledge about, hey, here are the people we develop relationships with, here's some of the conversations we've had in the past. So
Exactly.
I still think some type of lead management process or system is helpful. It just may not be as high of a priority as someone who is heavy lead generation from advertisement.
Agreed. And sort of dovetailing into that point, another consideration to make is the overall culture of your firm and what your clients ultimately have come to expect from your firm, both currently and clients that'll retain you in the future. Do you have a heavy focus on creating a personal feel so that every client feels like their engagement is your only priority? Or are you more of a volume firm that prioritizes efficiency, speed of resolutions, and results for your clients? There's no right answer. You have to know what your firm's priorities are and then document that, because that will ultimately influence how much automation capability you need within your case management system.
Now, I'm curious from your perspective, because I think, you have a much broader and much more in-depth specialty in this area than I would, is, automation is constantly being talked about everywhere. So, how do you kind of help firms navigate, how do you navigate what level of automation makes sense for their firm and not really buying into the hype of, hey, AI is taking over, we need to do AI everything?
So that's a great point. And there's even a delineation there between what is classified as true AI or what is merely an automation that's running based on triggers and events. So really each firm has to determine what its needs are based on how it wants to operate in its ideal state. A lot of that comes down to the software nowadays is really good. And by having a clearly documented framework that delivers consistent results by just following a step-by-step series of directions, if you have that as a firm, which is really the first step before you can implement AI or automation, you have to have that clear framework in place. But assuming that is the case, the software is really good, and there's platforms that can automate 90% of the tasks required in a particular cadence. Some platforms can some platforms can automate 100%. So it all depends, again, how much involvement do you want the attorneys to have, and how much personal contact do you want them to have with the clients? Because in some firms, that is a big priority, to ensure that every client has this feeling, that's a priority, to make sure that every client has a positive experience working with the firm that you've curated, by making sure that there's logical touch points throughout the process. So I think that's really important. And before you can address the automation of the AI side, you first have to figure out how much involvement do you want the attorneys to have. Now, there are some tasks that can be heavily augmented by AI, but are certainly nowhere near being able to be fully automated. And I think those are great, because those really provide a great place for attorneys to be able to inject themselves into the process to bring more of that personality. But I mean, I have some firms, some PI firms, who their primary focus is like, we want speed to resolutions, we want quick settlements, and that becomes the value for the client. The client's not necessarily looking for phone calls every day with the attorney. They're coming to the firm because they've built that expectation, and they've built that reputation around, hey, we get really quick results for you, the fastest in the industry. So you just need to know what that is for your firm.
Nice.
Now, this is a quick one, but just you need to know, based on how your firm is set up, what ecosystem are you currently set up with for email management? Are you in the Microsoft camp? Are you in the Google camp? This will determine ultimately what systems integrate with those. I sort of have a similar view as you, Terrell, with the financial component as the email integration. I think a lot of times platforms will tout that as a headline feature, that we integrate with email platforms. In many cases, it is somewhat overrated. I think that there is utility there by being able to, for example, automatically capture documents that have been sent as attachment with emails, and then attach those to the matter, associate with those with the matter. That is beneficial, but most of the times for my firms, they don't use the inbuilt email capability. They still use their Outlook, right, or their G Suite. They don't like a new interface that looks foreign to them for tasks like email, which they've been doing since the dawn of man. So that's just something to consider as well, but you just need to make sure you document it in this step. Any comments from you on that one? Sure.
Yeah, I mean, I think that that's very true, because, one of the things that a lot of law firms will find is there are a lot of features that will be presented to you as, hey, this is a great feature. And it may be a novel feature. It may be a great feature. But I think at the end of the day, from an ROI standpoint, you have to go take a step back and say, okay, all right, what does that feature mean for us? Mm-hmm. And I've seen the same thing. Even, the accounting industry is very similar to the legal industry. And when we're looking at practice management softwares, the same thing pops up. People constantly tell you that, hey, our software, you can integrate your email. And I'm like, well, what percentage of people actually send emails through your system versus just going back to their own, format that they're used to? And, when you really look at it that way, you can start to evaluate, like, okay, which features actually matter to the decision that you need to make about your firm. And I think what that does is it keeps you from falling into this endless, I would say, fall down this tunnel of all of these feature overloads. It's really going back to, hey, what is your goal? And I think that's what you mentioned before about, going through that documenting process, because I think when people document, they should really highlight what, functionality, and not necessarily what features, but what functionalities are really important to their firm, and then find what features align with those functionalities.
Exactly. And in that order, I think, is the best way to approach it. Like, listen, we're not looking to create, to experience novelties here. We're looking for functionality that actually drives business, measurable results in your business. Like, we want to increase the capacity of the attorneys to create better quality work in a shorter time span. So it can be very easy to get caught up in the marketing hype. These companies, they They hire, very experienced individuals who know how to communicate the message in a way that's appealing and enticing. But ultimately, we have to cut through that to be able to determine what's actually necessary in order to move to create measurable results within the firm. Okay, so on that same vein of email preferences regarding the system that you're using, you also need to consider the device ecosystem that you're primarily using it within your firm. Are you a Windows-based firm? Are you a Mac-based firm? How about for mobile devices? People forget about that, but many of these case management platforms have mobile apps. So are you an iOS firm? Are you an Android firm? And you want to just really take a survey and see what the majority of the users in your firm are using. I can say usually the primary consideration is the type of computers that they're using, right? So there are platforms that only work within the Windows environment. I'm actually not aware of any that only work in the Mac environment. So, so that becomes a consideration there, because obviously today, the whole goal is we're talking about case management systems that are cloud-based. There are a few scenarios in which on-premise software does make sense for firms, but I think for the purpose of this conversation, to keep things simple without getting overly complex, we're talking about cloud-based platforms. So, and there are platforms that you have to install an executable on your computer in order to access the cloud-based system. And that becomes a consideration you need to take in mind, or to keep in mind. Then also, from the mobile device standpoint, many of these platforms use apps. And these apps can be used for anything from just quickly checking notes when you're in a hearing, or they can be used for creating time entries and the associated narrative to go along with that. So you want to really just make sure you document what that is, so that way you can ask these questions when you're evaluating these systems with the respective vendors.
Yeah, and I think that's a really good point, because I think sometimes the firms do skip over that, where they pick a system based on the features or the functionality, but then they forget to really ask themselves, well, hey, if this only works with Windows computers and you have, Apple products on your team and key people on your staff, then it's just like, hey, you're going to limit your ability to actually get the most value out of, this decision. So I think that is something to really look at is, what is your software ecosystem, and make sure you pick a tool that is compatible with what your software or your device infrastructure is.
Right, and I'll just spare you some time in an exercise that will likely result in a failure. Don't try to use Parallels on the Mac environment to run Windows software. There's so many firms who have tried that, and it always resulted. Parallels requires like twice the computing power of running a native application. So you'll just run into performance issues. I would not recommend it in any scenario. And another thing that I want to tell you too, since we're on the topic of hardware devices, we actually survey all of our clients yearly as well as prospects. And when we want to determine what are the most sought after features in case management systems, funny enough, one of the most popular pieces of feedback we receive is that not necessarily features within the case management platforms. It's actually that these staff members just crave better hardware to use. It's almost like the software has gotten so good we've forgotten about the underlying component, the hardware that it runs on. So if you're having the staff in your firm use these platforms on computers that don't have enough memory, or they're not using solid state drives, or they have really small displays, it's really going to affect the productivity of your staff. So that's just a little quick PSA just from my experience to you, is that make sure that you and your firm have the proper devices. Most of the work that we do nowadays, we're using web browser-based platforms, but we tend to open a lot of tabs. So that does require a good amount of memory. I would say at a baseline, you need 16 gigabytes of memory in your computer. Ideally 32, and you're doing great if you have 64. Make sure the computer has a solid state drive. You don't want to be waiting for your hard drive to spin and load files and documents. So, just by having those things in place, you can drastically improve the productivity of your staff, but also their overall level of satisfaction. Okay, Next up is relating to the software selection. You need to really take a hard look at your firm's staff and determine the level of tech proficiency that exists there. To be honest with you, there are very customizable case management systems out there that have a high learning curve to understand the basic principles and how to operate, do simple things like billing a client or creating a time entry. The benefits can be that they're just more customizable, so they can fit a wider variety of firms, but you really need to know what the overall proficiency of your staff is. So what I normally recommend my clients do is just create a little spreadsheet of all the people in your firm, and then have them answer what their level of tech proficiency is on a scale of 1 to 5, 1 being the least tech proficient and 5 being they're a rock star. And then just take the average and then use that as the number that you're going to proceed forward with. If you're at a 3, sort of a baseline state, you really want to make sure that you implement a platform that is heavily focused on ease of use in the user interface. You really will wind up having issues if you have a system that's too complex to use. The individuals just they will never buy in on it because it's too difficult to operate in.
Absolutely. I think that is a important point. And I do often tell different firms is when you're looking at, picking the firm or picking the solution that will work for your firm, when it comes down to looking at the return on investment, I think to your point you just mentioned is if we go with a tool that is great and it's new, but now it takes your attorneys, let's say, twice as long to actually document their casework, then what that means is that, hey, you're losing some of their productivity, meaning that you're potentially losing revenue by using this new system. Now, on the other hand, if let's say you picked a system that had, template, data entry that they can use a template to get that data in there faster. Let's say if they're able to work on more cases because the way the system is designed, it allows them to enter their information quickly and then they can get back to the legal work. So let's say mathematically, if they're able to do 2 extra billable hours a week because of this efficiency, you start to be able to calculate and put a dollar amount to like what's the ROI, because if this system helps every lawyer add 2 billable hours a week, just do the math and you can start to see like, hey, this thing can really pay for itself eventually. And so I do think you want to consider things like that of if we do implement this system, what is this going to do to the capacity and the efficiency of the team that does the legal work? Is it going to help us generate more revenue, or is this going to slow us down? Because then you can put a dollar amount to say, hey, is there actually a return by making this decision?
Agreed. And then all of those efficiency gains, they ultimately stack upon each other and they increase linearly as you think about those metrics across your firm staff. So if you have that 2 hours that's being now billed by one attorney, but you have 10 attorneys in the firm, now you're talking about real money and time that's being generated as just a result of recouping on the inefficiencies that were there by implementing better tech.
Absolutely.
Okay. Next up is the consideration of the growth and expansion plans of your firm. So obviously right now you're looking at this implementation from the perspective of where your firm is currently positioned. But where is your firm going? Do you envision hiring on a substantial number of attorneys or paralegals? Or are you going to open up a second office? All of these considerations need to be taken into account as you're selecting the platform, because you want to ensure that you leave yourself enough overhead to be able to expand, and that you're not a year or 2 down the line going through the same exercise again, picking a new practice management system because you ran out of overhead.
Yep, and I think that's an easy mistake for a lot of companies to make is we're going to pick what works for us today. And you kind of forget to think down the road of like, hey, over the next 2 to 3 years, what are you going to do? Like, what is the plan? Is the plan to see, 30% growth, 20% growth, or is your plan to grow by 50%? Because what you don't want to do is you don't want to run into a situation where you go through the process of getting a new case management system that works for how you operate today, but then you grow by 20% or you grow by 25, or more percent. And then next year you're hitting new pain points because the system you picked last year does not actually accommodate the new level of functionality or the new level of operation that you have this year. So then you got to go through another painful process of switching your case management system again in 2 years in a row. And that's just not the most efficient use of your time as a law firm. So I think that is a very wise thing, is to think ahead of what does our growth strategy look like? Are we planning to grow, I would say 20% or more? Then you definitely need to be planning out your technology solution for where are we going, not where are we today.
Right. That's so important to keep that into consideration. And one of the things, too, is that this is a common question that I've received from firms as of late, which is, Jay, it seems like I'm spending money on technology every year. It seems like there's always something new, a new initiative, a new platform, something that's going to make us more efficient. And I think this really signals a fundamental change in the legal technology market, specifically in that we're no longer investing in servers and then you install one software platform on it, and the pace of innovation is so slow that there really aren't any major noteworthy developments that are worth considering for 5 years or 6 years or 10 years. Now we live in a day and age, especially with the rapid advancement and integration of AI into our firms, where there are regular major leaps that are being made in the technology space that serve a utility, like really create the fertile ground for firms to be able to take advantage of these technologies to perform their work faster and more accurately. So firms really need to sort of adopt the mentality that these technology expenses they're recurring expenditures. You should expect to continue to invest in technology, at least if you have plans to keep scaling the firm, because rather than think about just the fixed cost, as we alluded to previously, you have to start thinking about the ROI that you can gain. And every decision you make, you're measuring that against, is there a perceptible ROI that's created by leveraging this technology? If the answer is no, you don't move forward. But if it's yes, it really it creates a strong case to bring to your executive committee of your firm and have a further conversation about whether this makes sense to actually adopt.
Absolutely. I totally agree.
One of the big sticking points for firms is that they want to ensure that the new technology platform is compatible with their existing tech stack. So, this really requires firms to think about and to document your existing tech stack. And again, you can use the document that we provided. You want to document what all the supporting tools that you use are. So e-signature platforms, electronic payment platforms, what word processing software do you use? What accounting package do you currently use? You want to just make sure that you document all of these supporting systems so that when you have the conversation with the vendors, you can mention those specifically and get a definitive yes or no answer on whether interoperability exists between those. Because the last thing you want to do is have redundant data entry where you're inputting in a lead in, and then when that lead retains your firm, you're then taking all of that information, the contact details, the matter type, and then having to rekey that into your case management system. So you want to make sure that that compatibility exists. And really for this, there's, I wish I could give you a magic silver bullet way to sort of figure out what the compatibility is. That a lot of the work that we do is just we have internal matrices that list out what tools are compatible with what. But for this particular exercise, I think at least documenting what those are so that you can ask those questions directly when you're having those conversations with the vendors, that'll be, that's a large portion of the battle right there.
And I think one great way to get those questions answered is to attend like industry-wide type of events. Now, I know that there are some of the case management softwares that have their own conference. And the thing about those are you're just going to see their case management solution there. They aren't going to have competitors at their conference. But when you go to more industry-wide events, you're going to see a variety of different ones. Like probably the biggest one that I've seen is the American Bar Association, or the ABA Tech Show, which happens in Chicago, and I think this year it's happening in April. Mm-hmm. And there you're going to see, I mean, just about every case management vendor is going to be there. And what I would suggest for people to do is download the resource that we put in the notes, and you can even just walk around with it and just ask each of them the questions. So then you can take a step back and say, okay, all right, here's how each of the key platforms that I talked to, here's how they answered the questions in these key areas. Because I think what it's going to do is it's going to give you a better kind of scorecard to compare apples to apples. Because what you will find is if you're doing the research on your own, you'll find that all of these case management softwares have their own way of describing what they do. Now, if you're someone like Jay or someone on Jay's team, you will be able to understand, okay, they're just using different words to explain the same thing. But if you don't have that level of expertise, like, you won't be able to do that. But I think using like the resource that we're going to include there, it'll help you kind of put apples to apples, so that one is, you know what questions to ask, and you can sit and look across the board and say, hey, well, these three softwares are actually compatible with what I need. So then when it comes down to you having this discussion internally with your steering committee or your decision makers, you don't go in with a list of 160 options. You can go in with a more reasonable list of like, hey, these 4 platforms, let's look into these, and then let's, make a decision. And if that's a bit overwhelming, I would suggest that you reach out to, Jay and ask them to help you, walk you through that process. Because I think trying to go at this alone and trying to go at this with no template, no guidance, and alone can be a very expensive endeavor.
Right. Just yesterday, I made a LinkedIn post about some of the challenges that previous client that I mentioned who was selecting their case management system. And I had an attorney respond saying, hey, which system did not support leads billing? So to me, that supports my theory, which is that there's so many criteria that are responsible for making sure you get it right, and you really only get one shot. So that's why it's so important to use this framework, use this methodology, figure out what these functionality requirements are, and then use that to really take a very tactical approach at tackling this task, because ultimately this will be the main primary way that you interface with your firm. A couple more, and obviously we're seeing here, we've been having so much fun going in depth, and I think this is good, the level of detail that we're hitting on here. Of course, encourage all the listeners to, if you like this level of detail, let us know if you want more or less, so we can kind of fine tune it. But we're not going to have time to get into the identify stage here. The good thing is that the way video works is we can make another, and then we'll devote another video to the identification stage. So I think we'll get in a smoother rhythm as we do more of these. But so let's just go through the last couple criteria here, and then we'll close out and handle it that way. So the next one, this is sort of a two-parter. You need to take into consideration what your firm culture is. Now, there are many metrics that you can measure your firm culture by, but for the context of case management systems, really what I'm looking to get at is, does your firm operate in more of a siloed or a team-based structure where you have these bespoke individuals or teams that primarily perform a certain level of work and don't necessarily communicate regularly with the other members of the firm? Or is it a more collaborative environment? Do you have rainmakers that bring in work, that assign it amongst other attorneys or teams of attorneys within the firm, where there's a lot of sharing and collaboration happening? Based on that, that'll determine what level of collaborative features you need in your case management system. And then sort of alongside of that is another functionality requirement that dovetails really well into that, which is, how large is your document repository? So if you have individual lawyers who are sharing documents and using them to reference like contracts and purchase agreements, those type of things, you'll want to make sure that you store all of these documents centrally within your case management system so that they're accessible to other attorneys. Again, if you operate in more of a siloed fashion, maybe you have those documents stored externally and you won't necessarily need to pull those into the case management system. Usually my recommendation is, regardless of how the firm culture is oriented, it makes sense to have a central repository and have them all the documents stored in your case management system, because most of them still allow you to set up granular permissions where you can approve or deny access to certain folders and documents. So it really is just a sort of a good data hygiene practice to have it all centralized, because then you can do some really interesting things at a later stage. Let's say you want to implement AI and you want it to be able to perform some really useful functions for the firm, like being able to use your own document library as a knowledge base in order to produce other documents for the firm. That's not possible if you have them scattered externally. So that's sort of my 2 cents on it. But Terrell, I'm curious if you have any piece of feedback on those two components, the document repository size as well as the firm culture.
Yeah, I think on the firm culture, you do have to keep in mind, like he said, is, do we operate pretty collaboratively? Like, how many handoffs are happening between the staff within the firm? Because if you're in a situation where, let's say, hey, there's a paralegal, there's a legal assistant, there's an attorney, and there's a lot of overlap. And also something that's very real in the way firms operate now is they may not all work in the same office. Maybe you have a remote kind of arrangement with your staff, meaning your paralegal is in another country, or your legal assistant is in one part of the city or one part of the state, and the attorney's in another. Well, you're going to need your tool to have the capability to be able to share information, and you may need to have more real-time updates. So if the paralegal makes a change, the attorney can be able to see it. And so you do want to factor in some of those things, because I will say it will impact how you operate. If you're going to have a remote team, you need to make sure, can the software support that? If you're going to have an in-office team, meaning everybody physically comes into the office, everyone is there, you may not need a lot of the advanced real-time updates, because they can just have the conversation. So I wouldn't say you don't need them at all, but it may not be as high of a priority. And so I do think you do need to consider like your culture, how you actually operate your firm, because that will impact document management and your capacity for, functionality in your system.
Well said. Well said. Okay, let's take this thing home. Let's talk about the last component that needs to be considered, which is one that I know you'll have quite a few comments on. And this is the reporting, the leadership reporting and KPIs that the firm needs in order to make business decisions for the firm. So from my perspective, there's sort of aspirational goals that a firm may have around the metrics that they would like to be able to collect and report on regularly in order to make decisions. But then there's also the realistic perspective, which is, which metrics are you actually using today? Are you tracking your utilization rate of the attorneys? What about realization, or are you tracking your collection rates? Are you tracking the lead to retain rate? Are you tracking the people that actually, the percentage of prospects that actually come to their consultation versus scheduled? Right? There's all these metrics that, sure, it'd be great to have all of those, but which ones are you actually using today, and which ones can you reasonably foresee yourself using in order to actually guide and drive your business decisions?
Absolutely. And we're going to have multiple conversations when it comes down to KPIs and reporting, to where we dive into what some of these mean. But for now, when it comes down to picking your case management software, a couple of things that I tell people to really ask is, well, what is the reporting capability? Because most case management softwares, you're going to be putting a lot of information in it. The real question I have from a leadership standpoint is, can we get the information out of the system? And there are so many times, like I've sat down with firms where we were trying to figure out something, we're trying to figure out, okay, all right, well, what stage of the case are we spending most of our time on? And because no one asked this question before they picked the case management software, there was no way for us to get that data out of the system. And that becomes a very, very useful piece of information, because then you're making hiring decisions of like, well, what if we hired a paralegal to do this part, which would free up the attorney's time to then go do more valuable things? Well, because we couldn't get access to the data, we weren't able to really look at it to make those type of decisions. So I would say the first thing you want to ask is, what level of access will you have to being able to see like summarized results of all of the data that's going into your system? And then like, do they have dashboards, or will you have the ability to download the data and pull it out of the system and kind of do some analysis? And a very big thing on that is a lot of systems may tell you that, hey, yeah, you can download your data. A very important question to ask is, what formats can I download the data? Am I just going to get a PDF? Because it is difficult to analyze a PDF document, as opposed to, can I download it in a spreadsheet format? Because if I can download it in a spreadsheet format, it is a lot easier to do different types of analysis in a spreadsheet, as opposed to just getting a PDF. And so I think when you look at those capabilities, what level of detail or what level of information will I be able to access? Will I be able to export my key performance indicators out of the system so that I can look at it the way that I want to see it? And what is the format? Is it PDF only? Is it on the screen only? Or can I download it in spreadsheet format?
Agreed. And, in our next installment, we'll get into the specific questions that you can ask, and then also basically how to turn all of this information that you've now documented into useful information that'll help guide your decision. But it's so often that firms will have these requirements of what they need. For example, I have a firm who has 7 different compensation types for their attorneys. There's supervision fees, there's origination fees, there's 7 different types of compensation. So they need the ability to report on that information so that they can make the payment disbursements on time. When I first started working with this client, these payments were supposed to be due by the 8th day of the month, and they sometimes were not even making those payments in the same month. It was the following month. So, from your standpoint, when you're thinking about this and documenting, you just need to understand and document what data and KPIs do I need now. And then in the next step, we'll tell you how to extract that information from these vendors, so that way you can get definitive answers of whether their platform supports that.
Absolutely.
So I think that, we covered a lot of ground today. So I certainly learned a lot just speaking with you, Terrell, and it's always interesting hearing your perspectives. It's given that we both focus exclusively on law firms, it's always a richer, deeper conversation. So any closing thoughts before we close up this time? And then obviously next time we come back, we're tackling the identify stage.
Yeah, I would say, I think for the audience, we go deep into these topics because these are some of the real world questions that law firms have and law firms ask us. And I think that's why it'll be very helpful for the audience to download some of the resources and tools that we'll share, because I think those resources and tools will help you navigate this journey if you want to do it yourself, so that you kind of don't get lost in the features or you don't get lost in the questions, but these will be helpful guides for you to help you, make it through this journey effectively.
Agreed, agreed. Yeah, we'll continue to refine the format as we go. Hopefully, you enjoyed this installment. And hey, you'll have to excuse a little bit of clunkiness and awkwardness as we figure out what this is going to be. But ultimately, our goal is to just keep bringing value to you so that you can run a better, more profitable firm. So, again, I'm Jay McAllister, and that's Terrell Turner, and we'll see you on the next one.